Alright, so this is supposed to be a brief overview of the protocol for part 2 of our reverse transcriptase PCR reactions. This week we are going to be testing the quality and the concentration of our RNA samples that we isolated the week prior, and I'm going to show you a brief overview of some of the steps in the protocol as well as some of the equipment we'll be using today. So in step 1, if you or your group have volunteered to pour some of our agarose gels, here are some of the equipment you'll be using. So the buffer we'll be using to produce our agarose gels today is called MOPS buffer. So either you will be producing a diluted version of this from our stock concentration, or you'll be working with our TAs to produce a 1x solution. We're going to dissolve a fixed amount of agarose powder into our MOPS buffer, and then we'll be microwaving it with our microwave here. And once our agarose solution has sufficiently cooled, we can use that to pour into our gel electrophoresis setup here, which is in this image. We have it set up with our dams, so we'll pour our liquid solution in here and just give it some time, and then it will cool down, and we'll use this later in the lab. So while our gels are cooling, we are going to retrieve our RNA samples from last week's lab from the -80, or your TA or instructor will. We are going to allow those to thaw rapidly in your hand. And then in here in this image, we have a heat block as well as a vortex machine. So you guys should have used vortexes last week, so we should know how to use those. You push down on them, they shake your sample, helping distribute things evenly throughout them. And then on the left of this image is a heat block. So this is where we're going to do step 2, where we're going to place our sample in here. Our heat block is going to maintain our sample at 70 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes. So in step 3, we were going to use this machine here, or this instrument. So this is a nano drop. This is going to allow us to calculate the concentration of the RNA in our samples. It's also going to give us information pertinent to the potential genomic DNA contamination as well as protein contamination. So if you can see here, this is the instrument and how it looks. If you look closely in the image here, there's a tiny little drop where we are going to be placing our 1 microliter of sample. And then in this portion here, you can see that if necessary, you can use 2 hands to accurately. Because we'll be using the nano drop to calculate the concentration of RNA from many different samples throughout our labs, it's important to note proper cleaning procedure. So between the testing of samples as well as our blank, we are going to want to spray a Kim wipe with deionized water and wipe both the bottom and the top of the nano drop. This will ensure we aren't contaminating our readings of RNA concentration between samples. So after calculating the concentration of RNA in our samples, we're going to work through our table and some math to basically set up the proper preparation of our samples to run on our gels. And so here's some of the equipment we're going to be using throughout the next steps in the procedure. So we have a rapid spin down centrifuge here for microtubes. We have an image of a closed thermocycler as well as an open thermocycler. So this is the instrument that's actually going to heat our samples and then cool our samples rapidly. We're going to come back to this and use this in next week's lab, where we are doing our repetitive PCR processing. Here is another centrifuge that we may use to rapidly spin down our samples. And then next we are going to move on to loading our gels. After we've worked our way through steps 3 and 4 with the help of your instructor or your TA, we are going to begin to load our RNA gel. So you can see here, feel free to use 2 hands to stabilize the loading process. Your goal is to place the pipette tip as far down into the well as possible so that you're not dispersing your sample over the top of the gel or missing the well of the gel. And while loading the wells, you want to dispense your pipette down to the first stop and stop at the first stop. You do not want to depress your pipette to the second stop, because this will inject an air bubble into your well, which will basically disrupt your sample, throwing it up out of your well and throwing it over the gel, which will basically make everything messy and not as clean as it could be. After our gel has completed running, your samples and your gels should look something like this. There should be a high band and a low band. We want to make sure that we stop the gel from running before our low band runs off the bottom. Your TA and instructors will make sure this doesn't happen. Once our gel is done running, we'll work with you to bring it over to our imager, where your TA and or your instructor will set up an imaging protocol to allow you to collect your final image of your gel. And we will discuss the specifics in lab of what a good gel versus a bad gel look like. In the image here, the two samples on the right are considered to be good, so we have low RNA degradation. We have two clear bands representative of the ribosomal RNA from our samples, and on the far left we have streaky bands representative of degraded RNA from samples that may have been exposed to RNase.